Winter in 1944 didn't just freeze the mud of Western Europe. It froze the blood in every soldier's veins. In the war room of the Third Army, General George S. Patton stood over a massive map spread across an oak table, his hand resting heavy on his ivory-handled revolver. But the frost in Patton's eyes wasn't caused by the bitter Ardennes cold, nor was it caused by the formidable panzer divisions standing in his path. It was caused by something far more dangerous, something lurking right inside his own headquarters. 3 supply convoys had been obliterated in less than 48 hours, struck with mathematical precision before they even reached the front lines. The coordinates hadn't been broadcast over open radio channels, nor had they been written on any physical paper that left the war room. Only 5 men had known those routes, and all 5 of them ate at Patton's personal table. Patton leaned over the map, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth groaned, and muttered a sentence that made the room freeze colder than the blizzard outside. "Someone in this room is sending my boys to their graves, and before the sun sets tomorrow, I will skin them alive." Among those 5 men was Captain David Miller, a soft-spoken intelligence officer from Ohio who had been by Patton's side since the sands of North Africa. David knew the general better than most. He knew that behind Patton's terrifying exterior, behind the harsh profanity and the iron discipline, was a man who wept in private when he saw a truck full of young casualties. David watched Patton pace back and forth like a caged predator, his boots echoing off the concrete floor of the requisitioned French manor. Sitting across the table was Major Vance, a weathered veteran who had earned a Silver Star in the Great War, and Sergeant Arthur Hayes, a quiet mapmaker whose fingers were constantly stained with ink and grease. Standing by the door was Captain Robert Sterling, a charismatic young officer for a wealthy Boston family who managed communications. 5 men who had shared rations, dodged mortar fire, and pledged their lives to the same flag. Yet one of them was a ghost, passing secrets directly into the hands of the German High Command. The suspicion felt like poison in the room, thicker than the wood smoke curling from the hearth. David could feel the eyes of his fellow officers darting sideways, every nervous swallow and every rustle of paper suddenly looking like a betrayal. Patton didn't call on the military police or start an official investigation. He knew that the moment standard investigators stepped into the building, the mole would go quiet, bury their radio, and wait out the storm while more soldiers bled on the snow-covered roads. Patton was a master of psychological warfare, and he decided to fight this war inside his own walls. He locked the heavy oak doors from the inside, placed 2 armed sentries outside with orders to shoot anyone who tried to step out, and turned around with an expression that made even the battle-hardened Major Vance lower his eyes. Patton looked at each of them individually, letting the silence stretch until the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like small explosions. He announced that a major fuel depot was being moved to a tiny village called Malmedy at midnight, a move that would decide the fate of the entire upcoming offensive. It was a complete lie, a phantom maneuver created solely to trap the rat in his house. Only the men in that room heard the order. Patton gave them no duties, allowed no one to leave for the lavatory alone, and sat in his wooden armchair with his boots propped on the table, watching their every breath. Hours crawled by like ice melting on a stone. The tension was so thick that the simple sound of Sergeant Arthur sharpening a grease pencil made everyone jump. Just past 10 o'clock that night, distant artillery shells began to rumble over the horizon. But it wasn't a general bombardment. Reports over the field phone confirmed the horrifying truth. German long-range guns had just opened fire with terrifying accuracy, obliterating the exact coordinates of the fake fuel depot in Malmedy. The trap had worked, but the reality hit like a sledgehammer to the chest. The traitor had somehow managed to transmit the information right out from under Patton's nose, without ever leaving the room, without touching a radio, and without speaking a word to anyone outside. Patton stood up slowly, his face devoid of all color, his hands steady as he unholstered his pistol. He looked at the 4 men sitting around the map table and whispered that one of them had just signed his own death warrant. The war room descended into a pressure cooker of panic and accusation. Major Vance slammed his fists onto the table, his face red with fury, accusing young Captain Sterling of using his frequent trips to the hearth fire to burn coded notes that carried chimney signals to spotters in the hills. Sterling furiously denied it, pointing his finger right back at Vance, reminding the room that Vance's family had deep historical ties to Germany before the war. David sat in the center, his mind racing, trying to analyze the physical impossibility of what had just happened. How could a message travel past locked doors, guarded windows, and 5 pairs of vigilant eyes? Patton didn't raise his voice. He walked behind each man, stopping directly behind Sergeant Arthur Hayes. The quiet mapmaker was trembling, his ink-stained fingers clutching a ruler so tightly his knuckles were white as chalk. Patton placed a heavy hand on Arthur's shoulder, and the young sergeant broke down into silent, convulsive sobs. But what Patton pulled out from under Arthur's desk wasn't a hidden transmitter or a secret codebook. It was a tiny, intricate mechanical device wired to the brass pendulum of the grandfather clock in the corner. Every time Arthur tapped his foot on a loose floorboard in rhythm with his pencil movements, the vibrations adjusted a small magnet inside the clock, altering the subtle radio frequency of the headquarters main receiver tube to pulse out shortwave Morse code signals through the external antenna on the roof. It was a brilliant, terrifying piece of espionage engineering. Major Vance immediately drew his sidearm, screaming that Arthur was a filthy red traitor who deserved to be shot against the courtyard wall before the ink on his maps could dry. Captain Sterling pulled back in disgust, demanding an immediate execution to satisfy military justice. Patton stood silent, watching Arthur kneel on the stone floor, weeping continuously with his face buried in his bloodied, ink-soaked hands. But as Patton stood over the man who had betrayed his army, he noticed something that didn't fit the profile of a hardened enemy spy. Arthur wasn't pulling out a hidden pill, nor was he shouting political slogans. He was reaching into his inner breast pocket with trembling fingers, pulling out a battered, tear-stained photograph of a young woman and a 4-year-old girl. When Patton snatched the photograph from his hands, Arthur didn't beg for his life. He begged for theirs. Through broken sobs, Arthur revealed the agonizing secret he had carried in complete isolation for 6 brutal months. His wife, Clara, and his little daughter, Lily, hadn't been living safely in occupied France, as the army believed. They had been captured by a ruthless SS intelligence unit in a small village near the border. 2 months ago, an unmarked envelope had been dropped on Arthur's desk with a photo of his daughter holding that day's local newspaper, along with a note detailing exact instructions. Provide precise movement coordinates, or every week he delayed, a finger from his 4-year-old girl would be delivered to his male quarter. Arthur was a father trapped in an impossible, soul-crushing hell, forced to choose between the lives of thousands of his fellow soldiers and the slow, horrific torture of his own child. The room went dead silent. The anger that had filled the air turned into a cold, heavy sorrow. Major Vance slowly lowered his weapon, looking at the floor in shame. Captain Sterling turned his back, unable to look at the photograph of the little girl. The choice facing General Patton was standard under the Articles of War. Treason during wartime carried a single, absolute punishment: court-martial and immediate execution by firing squad. Every officer in the Allied command would have signed the execution order without a second thought. Military protocol demanded it to preserve discipline and security. But George S. Patton was not a standard commander, and the way he operated went far beyond the cold text of military manuals. Patton stared at the picture of the little girl for a long, agonizing minute. He walked over to his desk, poured 2 glasses of cheap amber whiskey, and set one down on the floor in front of the sobbing sergeant. Then, in a voice that cut through the silence like a razor, Patton told Arthur that he was the most foolish, desperate, pathetic soldier he had ever commanded. Patton said that if Arthur had come to him on day 1, they would have handled it like men, but because Arthur had chosen to carry the weight alone, American blood was now on his hands. Arthur nodded, accepting his fate, and whispered that he was ready to face the firing squad if Patton would just try to save his girl. That was when Patton delivered the twist that no one in that room, and no one in the military high command ever saw coming. Patton grabbed Arthur by his collar, dragged him to his feet, and looked him dead in the eye. Patton declared that Arthur was not going to die by an American bullet, nor was he going to a military prison. Patton was going to make him pay for his crime in a way that was far more grueling, dangerous, and ruthless than a simple execution. Patton was going to use Arthur as the ultimate instrument of destruction against the very officers who were holding his family hostage. Instead of reporting the treason up the chain of command, Patton classified the entire war room, swearing Vance, Sterling, and David to absolute secrecy under penalty of treason. If the Allied High Command found out, Patton himself would face a court-martial for harboring a spy. But Patton didn't care about regulations when his men were involved. He immediately ordered a specialized, completely off-the-book strike team to assemble in the dead of night. Patton didn't ask for permission from Supreme Headquarters. He pulled 6 of his most battle-hardened recon rangers, men who existed in the shadows of the front line, and personally briefed them in the drafty manor basement. Patton laid out a plan so aggressive and insane that it shocked even his veteran commanders. He wasn't going to negotiate, and he wasn't going to send a ransom. He was going to send a strike force deep behind enemy lines into the SS-controlled village of St. Vith to tear the enemy cell apart from the inside. But to ensure the SS unit didn't suspect anything and execute the hostages before the strike team arrived, Arthur had to perform the most agonizing acting job of his life. Patton ordered Arthur to sit back down at that map table, tap out a massive piece of fake intelligence to his handlers, and pretend that everything was operating completely normally. Arthur's hands shook so badly he could barely hold the pencil, but Patton stood right behind him, his heavy hand resting on the back of Arthur's chair, giving him a steady, terrifying pillar of strength. Arthur tapped out the false transmission, telling the German High Command that Patton's main armored thrust was shifting 20 miles to the south, leaving an entire northern flank wide open for a counterattack. It was a massive lie that, if believed, would draw hundreds of German tanks directly into a lethal artillery funnel that Patton was quietly preparing. The German handlers took the bait, confirming receipt and sending back their standard coded acknowledgement. While the enemy was busy shifting their armor toward the fake flank, Patton's elite strike force, led by Captain David Miller himself, slipped across the icy river in complete darkness. They moved through deep snow drifts, avoiding enemy patrols and mines, guided only by the sketchy hand-drawn maps that Arthur had desperately created from memory of his family's location. The tension back in Patton's war room was suffocating. Patton didn't sleep. He sat in his chair, smoking his cigars that filled the room with thick blue smoke, staring at the radio set on the table. Every minute felt like an eternity, knowing that if the strike force was compromised, Arthur's family would die. The false intelligence would be exposed, and Patton's own career and legacy would end in total disgrace. Deep in the woods outside St. Vith, David and his rangers located the stone farmhouse where the SS intelligence unit was operating. Searchlights crisscrossed the yard, and heavy machine gun nests guarded every approach. Through high-powered binoculars, David spotted a small, barred window in the cellar of the adjacent barn. Inside, crouching on a pile of frozen straw, was a terrified young woman holding a tiny girl wrapped in a frayed wool blanket. Standing outside the cellar door were 2 SS officers, casually drinking wine and waiting for the next radio burst from their mole inside Patton's headquarters. David signaled his team. They didn't wait for air support or heavy armor. They executed a swift, brutal assault under the cover of a sudden snow squall. Suppressed fire took down the sentries before they could scream. The Rangers breached the farmhouse door with explosive breaching charges, clearing the enemy command post in a terrifying 30-second firefight. David kicked open the cellar door, his rifle raised, his face covered in soot and snow. Clara screamed, pulling her little girl close, believing her executioners had finally arrived. But David lowered his weapon, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a small, ink-stained wooden ruler that Arthur had handed him before they left. He held it out to the woman and whispered that her husband had sent them to bring her home. Back at the 3rd Army headquarters, the radio finally clicked to life at 3 o'clock in the morning. A simple, short code phrase echoed through the static speaker. The package is secured. In the drafty war room, Sergeant Arthur Hayes collapsed onto his knees, weeping so hard he couldn't breathe. Patton didn't offer a dramatic speech or celebrate. He simply took a long drag from a cigar, blew the smoke toward the ceiling, and ordered the radio operator to open the floodgates. Now that the hostages were safe, Patton's true, ruthless genius was unleashed upon the enemy. The false intelligence Arthur had fed the Germans had lured 2 whole panzer divisions into a narrow, exposed valley near Malmedy. The enemy thought they were ambushing an unprotected American flank, but as dawn broke over the frosted hills, they realized too late that they had marched directly into a monstrous trap. Patton had massed 4 heavy artillery regiments on the surrounding ridges during the night. On Patton's command, the hills exploded in an unrelenting storm of fire and iron. The German counteroffensive was shattered before it even began, saving thousands of American lives and turning the tide of the entire winter campaign. 2 days later, in a quiet, secluded medical tent far behind the front lines, Arthur was reunited with his wife and daughter. The reunion was tearful, quiet, and deeply emotional, free from the noise of war. Patton watched from the entrance of the tent, standing in the shadows with his trench coat draped over his shoulders. He didn't approach them for praise or thanks. When Arthur saw the general, he stood up straight, wiping his tears, and offered a crisp, formal salute, ready to accept whatever military punishment Patton still had a hand down for his initial betrayal. Patton walked slowly into the tent, looked down at the little girl who was now eating a warm piece of ration chocolate, and then turned his stern gaze to Arthur. Patton quietly informed the sergeant that his official military record would state he was honorably discharged due to severe combat fatigue, effective immediately. There would be no court-martial, no prison sentence, and no public stain on his name. Patton leaned in close and whispered that Arthur had committed a crime against his country, but he had done it out of love for his family, and Patton would rather command a man who loved his family too much than a coward who cared for nothing at all. Patton turned on his heel and walked back out into the freezing mud of the European theater, returning to his war room to lead his men onward toward final victory. The story of what Patton did in that drafty war room never made it into the official history books or the newsreels of the era. To the world, Patton remained the uncompromising, iron-willed general who smashed the enemy with unyielding force. But to the few men who sat in that locked room during the coldest night of 1944, they knew the truth about their commander. True power and ruthlessness aren't measured by how harshly a leader punishes a broken man. True leadership is measured by how far a leader will go to destroy the enemy, protect his soldiers, and heal the wounded souls under his command.